He was just 25 years old, a man with a future, with muscles built by labor and a gaze that bore the quiet determination of someone who had found meaning in work. Phineas Gage, a foreman on the railroad construction team in Vermont, had earned the respect of his crew not just for his leadership, but for his composure. He was the kind of man who rarely spoke more than necessary, precise, measured, trustworthy. Then came that afternoon in 1848, just an ordinary day, until it shattered into something extraordinary. They were clearing rocks to make way for the railway, using explosive powder to blast away earth. Gage was preparing a blast hole, tamping the powder with an iron rod. No one can quite explain what happened in the milliseconds that followed. Perhaps a spark, perhaps a miscalculation, but the tamping rod, over 3 feet long and more than an inch in diameter, launched into the air with unimaginable force. It entered his cheek, pierced behind his left eye, and exited through the top of his skull. He didn't fall, he didn't die. Phineas Gage stood up. What should have been a gruesome death turned into a miracle or a tragedy, depending on where you choose to focus your gaze. Witnesses said he walked, spoke, and even laughed shortly after the accident. Blood poured from his head, yes, but he was conscious, he was aware. It seemed unreal even to the doctors who treated him. Dr. John Harlow, who would later document the case extensively, marveled at how Gage not only survived the impalement, but began to recover. The wound healed, the swelling subsided, but something else had changed, something that couldn't be stitched shut. The man who returned to life was not the same man who had been impaled. There was an emptiness behind his eyes, an agitation in his tone. He cursed more. He made crude jokes. He became impatient, erratic, unpredictable. The calm, thoughtful leader had become a stranger to those who once trusted him. His employers didn't take long to notice. The railroad company, which had once praised him for his reliability, no longer saw the same man in front of them. He was dismissed. Friends described him as no longer Gage. That phrase stuck, haunting the margins of every scientific paper and psychological theory that emerged from his story. No longer Gage. It was not just a change in behavior, it was a transformation of essence. The soul, it seemed, had been disturbed. But what does it mean to say someone is no longer themselves? Can the self be so closely tied to neural architecture that a single injury can erase it or reshape it? In Gage's case, the answer was terrifyingly clear. The damage to his frontal lobe had altered the very circuits that regulate personality, empathy, judgment. This was not just a tragic curiosity, was the crack in the wall that let in a new kind of light. Before Gage, the idea that the brain governed personality was more theory than certainty. After him, psychology began to sharpen its gaze. Researchers began to explore the functions of specific brain regions, and the frontal lobe, once an undefined frontier, became a focus of intense inquiry. Gage's body became a map, his story a key. But beneath all the clinical fascination, there was still a man, a human being who had lost something ineffable, something that his doctors could not label and that his friends could not understand. He wandered from job to job, drifting like a ghost through towns that no longer welcomed him, and yet he survived. For 12 more years, Phineas Gage lived with a mind that no longer mirrored who he once was. A survivor, yes, but also a fragment. There is something unbearably haunting about the image of a man walking the earth with a piece of iron that had once ripped through his skull. After his death in 1860, Phineas Gage's skull and the infamous tamping rod were preserved, and placed in the Harvard Medical School Museum, where they remain to this day. Visitors come to see the evidence of the impossible, the skeletal, proof of a life that defied anatomy and logic. But what they cannot see is what was lost. They cannot see the warmth in his voice that disappeared, or the dreams that might have died quietly in the corners of his altered mind. For the world of science, Gage became a symbol, a case study, a phenomenon. But for those who knew him, he became a memory that didn't match the man in front of them. The story of Gage is often told in scientific circles as a triumph of survival, a window into neuroplasticity, resilience, the mysteries of the prefrontal cortex. But when you strip away the fascination, what remains is a very human question. How much of who we are depends on the integrity of our brain's delicate structure. It is terrifying to think that our moral compass, our sense of humor, our empathy, our restraint, these things we think of as ours, might hinge on fragile circuits of tissue and blood. That a single moment of trauma can rewrite the script of our personality, not like a scar, but like a new author seizing the pen. Gage's case ignited a century of debate. Was he proof that the soul is biological? Or was he a cautionary tale about how little we truly understand identity? As psychology matured into a science, as Freud explored the unconscious and Jung spoke of archetypes, the ghost of Gage lingered in the background, a reminder that there is no psyche without soma. The spiritual is etched into flesh, and when that flesh is damaged, even the spirit begins to distort. To this day, neurologists look to Gage when discussing the frontal lobe's role in emotional regulation. His case has been taught in universities, cited in countless papers, even fictionalized in books and films. Yet the man himself remains strangely absent. In all the data, all the hypotheses, Gage's humanity fades. But perhaps that's the price of becoming a symbol. You cease to be fully human. You become the lesson, the anomaly, the footnote that launched a discipline. And yet, something in his story resists full closure. Perhaps it's because, deep down, we recognize ourselves in him, not in his injury, but in the fragile illusion of continuity we all live with. We like to think we are one, indivisible, that who we are remains stable across time. But Gage reminds us otherwise. He was one man before 1848, and another after, still in the same body, still bearing the same name, and yet undeniably changed. He stands as a mirror, cracked but clear, showing us the terrifying truth. We are not as solid as we seem. And what does that mean for us? If a single event, a trauma, a surgery, a seizure can alter who we are at the deepest level, how can we trust our identity at all? Are we merely passengers in a biological machine, hoping the circuits remain intact? Or is there something more, something indestructible that survives even when the brain is broken? Gage never gave us that answer. He simply lived. And in his silent survival, he posed a question that still echoes in the corridors of psychology today. Imagine waking up one day and being told you're no longer the person you used to be. Not metaphorically, but in the literal sense. Your memories remain, your name remains, but the essence that once defined you, the temperament, the patience, the values has shifted. This wasn't a choice. It wasn't a slow evolution born of time or trauma. It was instant. This was the daily reality for Phineas Gage after the accident. He lived in a body that looked familiar to others, but his behaviors, his emotional responses, even his sense of right and wrong had fractured. He became someone else. And this quiet tragedy unfolded not in a hospital bed. but in the everyday moments that define a person, in conversation, in silence, in the way someone walks into a room and no longer feels welcome. His family struggled. His community recoiled. People didn't know how to speak to him anymore, and maybe they sensed something deeper than injury, something uncanny. It was as though the person they'd loved had died, yet his body walked among them. In the 19th century, there were no psychological terms like frontal lobe syndrome or executive dysfunction. There were no support systems for individuals suffering from neurological personality shifts. Gage became a drifter not by choice, but because the world no longer knew what to do with him. The skills that once made him a foreman were replaced by impulses he could not control. He found odd jobs, menial work, anything that didn't require trust or stability. In one chapter of his wandering, he ended up working at a traveling show, where he displayed the iron rod and recounted his own story, almost like a living museum. One can only imagine what it felt like to reduce his life to an exhibit, a curiosity. For coin, but even that, strange as it may sound, tells us something profound. Gage's attempt to integrate his trauma into narrative, to own it, to show it was, in its own way, a psychological act of meaning-making. He may have lacked the words for it, but on some level, he was participating in a primitive form of narrative therapy. This wasn't just a freak accident anymore. It was his life story. His survival became a performance, not just for others, but perhaps for himself. The rod that pierced his brain became both wound and relic, an object he could hold to remind himself and others that he still existed. Changed, yes. Damaged, yes. But not gone. This tension between loss and survival, between identity and change, lies at the very heart of modern psychology. It's a tension that resonates deeply with contemporary studies on brain trauma and identity. Veterans returning from war zones with head injuries often report personality changes, emotional volatility, or loss of empathy. Victims of strokes or tumors describe disconnection from their former selves. Loved ones struggle with how to relate to someone who is physically present but psychologically unfamiliar. And behind all of this is the unsettling realization: the self is fragile. Not the soul, perhaps, but the self, the day-to-day constellation of traits that make someone recognizable to others and to themselves. This is what Gage lost, and it's what so many fear to lose in silence. We build our lives on the assumption of psychological continuity, that who we are today will still exist tomorrow. But when that thread is severed by trauma, reality tilts. And what remains after that tilt? Is there a core identity that survives, some unbreakable spark beneath the layers of cognition and behavior? Or are we merely collections of patterns, vulnerable to rewiring at the mercy of biology? This is not a question of faith, but of neurology. The field of cognitive neuroscience, in its relentless search to map the mind, often finds itself circling the mystery that Gage embodies. We can trace circuits, measure brain activity, assign names to regions, but when a person becomes no longer themselves, we realize how much of our science still stands on unanswered questions. Perhaps Gage was not the first to experience this fracture of identity, but he was the first to leave behind both a skull and a story, two pieces of evidence that refused to be silenced. As the years passed and Gage's body grew tired, the mystery of who he had become deepened. He eventually made his way to South America, working as a stagecoach driver in Chile, a job that required coordination, memory, and focus. It was an unexpected turn, suggesting that some of his lost abilities may have returned. Some researchers have speculated that this might have been evidence of neural compensation. a sign that the brain was adapting, rebuilding new pathways around the damaged areas. If true, it would mark one of the earliest examples of what we now call neuroplasticity, the brain's astonishing capacity to rewire itself. But such speculation is always shadowed by the limits of history. We do not have video recordings, EEGs, or therapy notes from his time in Chile. We have only scattered accounts, fragments of narrative, glimpses into a life that still confounds the textbooks. When he finally returned to California to live with his family, it was clear that his health was deteriorating. Seizures began to haunt him. His body, which had survived so much, began to fail. In May of 1860, Phineas Gage died, 12 years after the day that changed everything. He was buried without fanfare, but a year later, at the request of Dr. Harlow, his family exhumed his body so that his skull could be studied. The iron rod was donated as well. It was an unorthodox request, even for the time, but perhaps they believed, in some way, that his life still had something to teach, that the trauma he endured might help future generations understand the mind not as something mystical and untouchable, but as something material, delicate, and devastatingly human. Gage's skull, resting now in a glass case, seemed silent. But for those who look closely, it speaks, not with words, but with absence, with the void carved by the iron. That void is a map, a question mark, a reminder. It reminds us that every decision we make, every emotion we feel, every piece of who we are may reside in places far more vulnerable than we wish to admit. We often say that people have heart or gut instinct, but the truth is, it's the brain that holds the music of our humanity. And when that music is disrupted, even briefly, the entire symphony of personality can collapse. That is what Gage's story forces us to confront. Not just the resilience of the body, but the fragility of identity. His life is a bridge between eras, a man of the 19th century who became a messenger for 21st century neuroscience. And yet, beyond the clinical insights, there lingers something deeply poetic. Gage didn't write books. He didn't give lectures. He left no letters, no memoir, but his silence became a kind of testimony. It is the space he occupied in the margins of medicine that tells us what it means to lose and still live, to become someone else and still be called by the same name. The questions his life raises are not limited to scientists or philosophers. They belong to all of us, to anyone who has watched a loved one change after trauma, to anyone who has felt themselves drifting from who they once were, to anyone who wonders what makes us who we are. And so, his story persists, not just as a medical case, but as a mythos, a modern-day parable, a man pierced by iron and transformed into a question, not a warning, but a mirror, one we cannot look away from, one that reflects, with cold precision, how much of our soul is tangled in neurons, how deeply our humanity depends on structures we cannot see. He did not choose to become this symbol. He simply lived through something that most would not survive. And in doing so, he became unforgettable. We often walk through life believing in a kind of psychological permanence that beneath the changes of age, mood, and circumstance, there exists a self that is stable, rooted, whole. But the story of Phineas Gage fractures that illusion with a single, violent moment. It reminds us that identity is not carved in stone. It is written in the folds of the brain, in the silent language of neurons and synapses, in the fragile architectures of thought and emotion. What happened to Gage was not just a medical event. It was a philosophical rupture, a collision between flesh and fate that exposed the raw mystery of what it means to be human. His story is not just about trauma, it's about transformation. The discomfort that arises when transformation is forced upon us. Gage did not choose to change. His identity was reshaped not by growth or experience, but by accident. And in that, he becomes a symbol for all the silent battles we fight when we feel alienated from ourselves. When something shifts inside, and we no longer recognize the person in the mirror. When we say, "I don't feel like myself anymore," but cannot explain why. And maybe that's why we still speak his name. Why students still study his skull. Why neurologists, psychologists, and storytellers return to that fateful afternoon in 1848. Because Phineas Gage is not just a man with a hole in his head. He is the embodiment of a question that haunts the edges of every mind. Who am I, really? And what happens if the answer changes? We may never know what Gage felt in his final years, whether he found peace, whether he mourned the man he used to be. But his story survives, not in search of a conclusion, but in service of a deeper truth, that the human mind is both terrifyingly fragile and astonishingly resilient. That identity is both precious and impermanent. And that somewhere between biology and memory, between trauma and survival, we begin to understand the strange, beautiful chaos of being alive.